Jake Dalton stepped off the transport shuttle and onto Station Kepler 9 with exactly two things: a duffel bag full of clothes and a sword strapped to his back. Not a plasma rifle, not a pulse cannon, not even one of those fancy disintegrator pistols that were all the rage in the outer colonies. Just a sword. A honest-to-God, forged steel, completely analog sword. The recruitment officer who'd hired him had been very clear. Humanity was the newest species to join the Galactic Coalition, and Earth needed representatives in every branch of the Alliance. The military academy was desperate for instructors who could teach close-quarters combat. Jake had 20 years of martial arts training, a background in medieval weaponry, and absolutely nothing to lose. Perfect candidate. What the recruitment officer had not mentioned was that every single alien species in the galaxy thought humans were adorable idiots. Jake found this out approximately 45 seconds after entering the Academy's main training hall. Commander Thraka stood at the front of the room, all 7 feet of him, with 4 muscular arms crossed over a chest that looked like it had been carved from granite by a sculptor who really hated subtlety. His scales were a deep purple, his eyes were the color of molten gold, and his teeth could probably bite through a shuttle door. He was addressing a classroom of about 30 cadets, representing a dozen different species, when Jake walked in. The room went quiet. Every eye turned to stare at the human. Thraka's mouth curled into something that might have been a smile on a creature that understood joy. On him, it looked like a predator spotting lunch. "Ah," Thraka said, his voice like gravel in a blender. "You must be the human instructor, Dalton, yes?" "That's me," Jake said, dropping his duffel bag by the door. "Sorry I'm late. Your station's gravity is a bit higher than I'm used to." One of the cadets, an insectoid creature with too many eyes, chittered, something that the translator rendered as laughter. Thraka's golden eyes drifted down to the sword on Jake's back. His smile widened. "Tell me, Instructor Dalton, is that your weapon of choice?" Jake knew a setup when he heard one. "It is. A blade," Thraka said slowly, savoring each word like expensive wine. "Made of sharpened metal. No power source, no energy field, no molecular edge. Just metal that you swing with your arms." "That's the general idea, yeah." The entire classroom erupted in laughter. Not polite chuckles. Full-blown, doubled-over, wheezing laughter. One cadet, a blob-like creature that might have been liquid, actually jiggled so hard it nearly fell off its chair. Thraka raised one hand, and the room fell silent again. "Forgive me, Instructor. I mean no disrespect to your species. I am sure that on your primitive world, such weapons were very effective against other primitives." Jake smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "No offense taken, Commander. However," Thraka continued, warming to his theme, "you should understand that we are training the finest warriors in the galaxy here. Our cadets will face enemies armed with plasma weapons, energy shields, and combat armor that could withstand a direct hit from an orbital strike. I am not certain how a sharp piece of metal will factor into their education. I guess we'll find out," Jake said. Thraka's expression shifted to something almost pitying. "Indeed we shall. Please, take a seat. We were just discussing advanced shield technology." Jake found an empty spot along the back wall and leaned against it, arms crossed. For the next 20 minutes, he listened to Thraka lecture about the latest developments in defensive equipment. The cadets took notes on holographic tablets. Nobody looked at Jake. That was fine. He'd been underestimated before. What Jake didn't expect was for Thraka to turn the lecture into a full-blown roast session with him as the guest of honor. "You see," Thraka said, gesturing at a holographic display of a shimmering energy shield. "Modern defensive technology has made primitive weapons completely obsolete. A blade like Instructor Dalton's would simply bounce off military-grade shielding. It would be like trying to cut through a starship hull with a butter knife." More laughter from the cadets. Jake said nothing. "In fact," Thraka continued, clearly enjoying himself now, "I would wager that Instructor Dalton's weapon could not even scratch the paint on standard coalition armor. Perhaps we humans should stick to teaching history classes instead of combat tactics." A few cadets actually applauded. Jake pushed off from the wall and walked toward the front of the room. The laughter died down. Thraka watched him approach with an expression of mild curiosity. "Something to add, Instructor?" Thraka asked. "Just a question," Jake said pleasantly. "You seem pretty confident in your shield technology." "I am." "Confident enough to put your money where your mouth is?" Thraka's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting?" Jake unstrapped the sword from his back and let it rest casually on his shoulder. "A demonstration. You pick the toughest shield in your armory. If I can't leave a mark on it with this primitive piece of metal, I'll resign. Right here. Right now." The classroom went dead silent. Thraka stared at Jake for a long moment. Then, slowly, his smile returned. And if you succeed, you apologize, in front of everyone, for calling humans primitive. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, or maybe a sword. Thraka's forearms unfolded. Agreed. Thraka didn't waste time. Within 5 minutes, he'd sent a message to the Academy's administration, and within 10, the entire student body was being summoned to the main arena. Word spread fast on a space station. By the time Jake walked into the massive circular chamber, there had to be at least 300 aliens packed into the full observation decks. This was going to be either the best or worst first day of work in history. The arena floor was a flat expanse of polished metal, big enough to host full-scale combat exercises. Overhead lights cast everything in stark white. Jake could hear the murmur of the crowd, the clicking and chittering and warbling of dozens of different species, all discussing the crazy human who thought he could scratch Varelium. He'd heard that word at least 50 times in the walk from the classroom to the arena. Varelium, the hardest substance in known space, formed in the cores of neutron stars, harvested by drones that cost more than a small planet, completely, utterly, impossibly indestructible. Great. Thraka entered from the opposite side of the arena, and the crowd roared. He was carrying something that looked like a riot shield, oval-shaped and about 3 feet tall. Even from across the arena, Jake could see it shimmer with an opalescent sheen, like oil on water. The surface seemed to drink in the light and reflect it in colors that didn't quite exist. "Behold," Thraka announced, his voice amplified through the arena's speaker system. "My personal shield, forged from pure Varelium, gifted to me upon my promotion to commander. It has turned aside plasma bolts, kinetic rounds, and even a glancing blow from an antimatter rifle. Not a single mark upon its surface." The crowd cheered. Someone started a chant in a language Jake's translator couldn't parse, but the meaning was clear enough. They were chanting Thraka's name. Jake walked to the center of the arena, sword in hand. Up close, the shield was even more impressive. The Varelium seemed to pulse with an internal light, and the craftsmanship was exquisite. The edges were perfectly smooth, the surface flawless. It was, objectively speaking, a work of art. It was also apparently going to be his resignation letter if he couldn't scratch it. "Having second thoughts, Instructor Dalton?" Thraka asked. He wasn't quite shouting, but his voice carried. He wanted the crowd to hear everything. "Just admiring the workmanship," Jake said. "This is beautiful. Custom made? On Varela Prime, by the master smiths themselves. The molecular structure is a lattice of interwoven crystalline bonds, each one reinforced at the quantum level. There is quite literally no stronger material in existence." Thraka held the shield out. "Please, examine it, touch it. Convince yourself of its authenticity." Jake stepped forward and ran his hand over the surface. It was cool to the touch, smoother than glass. He tapped it with his knuckle. The sound was a deep, resonant note that hung in the air. He walked around it, examining the edges, the back, the mounting handles. "How thick is it?" Jake asked. 2 inches at the center, tapered to 1 inch at the edges. "And the crystalline structure you mentioned? That's consistent throughout?" Thraka's expression flickered with something that might have been confusion. "Yes. Why do you ask?" "Just curious about the manufacturing process. Do they grow these crystals or forge them?" "They are grown in zero-gravity foundries over a period of months. Each crystal is seeded and allowed to form naturally, then bonded to its neighbors through a process I do not fully understand. The result is a single, unified structure with no weak points." Thraka was clearly enjoying showing off his knowledge. "The orientation of the crystalline bonds is randomized, you see, which prevents any directional vulnerability." "Randomized," Jake repeated. "Interesting. Indeed. Now, shall we begin this demonstration, or would you prefer to withdraw your challenge?" The crowd started booing. Someone threw what looked like a snack food at the arena floor. The natives were getting restless. Jake stepped back and looked at the shield one more time. Then he looked at Thraka. Then he looked up at the crowd, shading his eyes against the lights. "I'm going to need about 15 minutes, Jake said. The arena went quiet. 15 minutes? Thraka repeated. "For what?" "To prepare. You know, sharpen my blade, get my head in the game. Maybe do some stretches. I'm not as young as I used to be, and your station's gravity is murder on my knees." Thraka stared at him. "You want me to wait while you stretch? Unless you want me pulling a hamstring in front of all these people. That would be embarrassing for both of us." For a moment, Jake thought Thraka might refuse. The commander's forearms tensed, and his golden eyes narrowed to slits. But then he threw his head back and laughed. It was a booming sound that echoed off the arena walls. "By all means, Instructor Dalton. Take your 15 minutes. Take 20 if you need them. The outcome will be the same. Thraka gestured to one of the arena exits. There is a preparation room through that door. I will wait here with my shield. The crowd will wait. We all want to see this. The crowd laughed and jeered as Jake walked toward the exit. He could hear them placing bets, arguing about how quickly the human would fail. Some were speculating he wouldn't even try, that he'd just slink away and never come back. Jake smiled to himself as the door hissed shut behind him. He had 15 minutes to figure out how to do the impossible. Good thing he'd been paying attention during Thraka's lecture. The preparation room was small and functional. A bench, a weapons rack, a sink, and a full-length mirror. Jake set his sword down on the bench and pulled out his phone. Yes, his phone. The same device that had made the aliens on the transport shuttle look at him like he'd brought a stone tablet to a hologram convention. He opened his notes app and started typing everything he remembered from Thraka's bragging session. Crystalline structure, zero-gravity foundries, months of growth, quantum-level reinforcement, randomized orientation of bonds. That last part was the key. Thraka had said it like it was a feature, but to anyone who actually understood materials science, randomized crystalline bonds were both a strength and a potential weakness. Random meant unpredictable, sure, but it also meant inconsistent. And inconsistent meant there were patterns if you knew how to look for them. Jake had spent 5 years of his life studying Japanese sword-making techniques. Not because he was some kind of weeb, but because metallurgy was fascinating, and ancient bladesmiths had figured out things about material science that modern engineers were only just beginning to understand. They'd learned to read metal, to see its grain, to find the natural lines of stress and work with them instead of against them. He pulled his sword from its sheath and held it up to the light. The blade was folded steel, layered and hammered and folded again, more than 200 times. Each fold created thousands of microscopic layers, each one adding strength and flexibility. The edge had been ground and polished to a molecular sharpness. It wasn't a plasma cutter, but it was sharp enough to split a human hair lengthwise. More importantly, it was precise. That was the whole point of a sword. Precision over power, technique over strength. Jake looked at his reflection in the mirror. Okay, Dalton, you've talked yourself into a corner. Time to science your way out. He spent the next 10 minutes running through the physics in his head. Beryllium was a crystalline structure, which meant it had a grain, even if that grain was randomized. Crystals fractured along specific planes based on their molecular bonds. If he could identify the orientation of those bonds on the shield's surface, he could angle his cuts to exploit the natural stress points. It was the same principle as cutting a diamond. You didn't just hack at it. You studied the crystal structure, found the cleavage plane, and applied force at exactly the right angle. One precise tap in the right spot could split a diamond in half. 1,000. Random hits wouldn't even scratch it. The difference was, he didn't have time to study the shield properly. He'd have to read it on the fly, make micro-adjustments with each cut, and hope his eyes were good enough to spot the patterns in real time. No pressure. When he walked back into the arena, the crowd's jeering had turned to impatient murmuring. Thraka stood in the center, still holding his shield, looking like a statue of military confidence. Finished with your stretches? Thraka called out. All limbered up, Jake replied. He walked to the center of the arena, sword held loosely in one hand. So, just to confirm the terms. If I scratch your shield, you apologize. If I don't, I resign. Correct. And you'll accept any mark on the shield as proof? Even a small one? Thraka's smile was predatory. Instructor Dalton, if you can make even the tiniest imperfection on this shield, I will not only apologize, I will personally recommend you for a commendation. I am that confident. Great. One more thing. Can you hold the shield steady? I'd hate for it to move and mess up my attempt. I will hold it as still as stone. Thraka planted his feet and held the shield out at chest height, gripping it with 2 of his 4 arms. The other 2 arms crossed behind his back in a gesture of absolute confidence. The crowd leaned forward in their seats. Jake approached slowly, studying the shield's surface. Under the arena lights, he could see faint patterns in the opalescent shimmer. Lines of slightly different coloration, so subtle they were almost invisible. Crystalline boundaries, the places where different growth zones met and bonded. There, he could see them. Jake raised his sword and placed the edge against the shield's surface at a shallow angle, maybe 15 degrees. He didn't press down, just made contact, felt the material, let his hands read the feedback through the blade. Any day now, Thraka said. Jake ignored him. He adjusted the angle. 20 degrees. Then 18. Then 19.5. There. He could feel a difference in the resistance, like the blade wanted to settle into a groove that wasn't quite there yet. He drew the sword across the surface in a long, smooth pull. Not a chop, not a stab, a draw cut, the kind you'd use to slice through a tatami mat. The blade whispered across the beryllium. Nothing happened. The crowd started laughing again. Jake repositioned, tried a different angle on a different part of the shield. Another draw cut. Still nothing. Perhaps you need another 15 minutes? Thraka suggested. Jake didn't answer. He was too focused. The patterns were there. He could see them now, clearer with each attempt. The crystalline structure wasn't perfectly random. It couldn't be. Nature didn't work that way. There were patterns. Fractals. Repeating structures at different scales. Third attempt. He found a spot where 3 different crystalline boundaries met, forming a junction point. He placed his blade at exactly 23 degrees, rotated it slightly to account for the curve of the shield, and pulled. The sword bit. It was barely perceptible. A whisper of resistance. But it was there. The blade had found purchase. Jake's smile was microscopic. Gotcha. He began to work in earnest now, making small, precise cuts. Each one built on the last, following the natural grain of the crystal structure. He wasn't trying to overpower the material. He was reading it, understanding it, and exploiting its own nature against itself. The crowd's laughter died. Someone in the front row stood up. Jake kept cutting. The blade moved in short, controlled strokes. He was carving now, following a pattern only he could see. The sword sang against the beryllium, a high, clear note that changed pitch with each angle adjustment. Thraka's smile faltered. "What are you doing?" Jake didn't answer. He was too busy carving the letter J into the shield's supposedly indestructible surface. The arena went absolutely silent. You could have heard a pin drop, or in this case, you could hear the whisper of folded steel cutting through impossibility. The J was perfect. Clean lines, smooth curves, about 3 inches tall, and carved a solid 1/4 inch deep into the beryllium. Jake stepped back to admire his work, then moved to the next letter. A was trickier. The diagonal lines required different angles, and he had to reorient his stance twice to maintain the proper cutting geometry. But once he found the right approach, the blade carved through like the shield was made of hard cheese. The crossbar of the A took 5 seconds. He didn't even break a sweat. "This is impossible," Thraka breathed. His forearms had gone rigid. The shield trembled in his grip. "Hold it steady, please," Jake said without looking up. "I'd hate to mess up the kerning." K was easier than the A. The vertical line followed a major crystalline boundary that Jake could see now as clearly as if someone had drawn it in marker. The 2 diagonal lines required some finesse, but his hands had found their rhythm. The sword felt like an extension of his nervous system. Every micro-adjustment was automatic. Someone in the crowd made a sound like a tea kettle whistling. Several cadets were standing now, pressing against the railings to get a better view. Jake could hear frantic whispers, the click and buzz of translator devices working overtime. E was practically therapeutic. 4 simple lines: horizontal, vertical, horizontal, horizontal. He finished it in under 30 seconds and paused to roll his shoulders. Thraka's gravity was still murder on his back. "You are cheating somehow," Thraka said. His voice had lost its commanding boom. Now it just sounded confused. "This is not possible. You are using some kind of Earth technology, a hidden energy field, a molecular destabilizer." Jake looked up at him. "Want to inspect the sword? No power source, no batteries, no circuitry, just about 3 pounds of folded steel, and a really good edge." "Then how? I'm not done yet. Hold still." D was a nice change of pace after all those straight lines. The curve required a different cutting motion, more of a rocking draw than a straight pull. Jake adjusted his grip and let the blade's natural curve do the work. The steel whispered secrets to the beryllium, and the beryllium, betrayed by its own structure, gave up its integrity, one crystalline bond at a time. The D took a full minute. Jake wanted it perfect. This was his signature, after all. Might as well make it look good. A again. Jake was getting efficient now. He'd mapped the major stress lines in the shield's structure. He knew where the crystal boundaries ran, where the growth zones overlapped, where the quantum reinforcement was strongest and where it was just slightly weaker. The second A took half the time of the first. L was a gimme. 2 lines, vertical and horizontal. Done. The crowd wasn't making any noise anymore. The silence was profound, almost religious. 300 aliens watched a human do something that violated everything they understood about materials, science, physics, and reality in general. Jake carved the T in long, confident strokes. The horizontal line at the top was perfectly straight. The vertical line bisected it with mathematical precision. He was showing off now, and he knew it, but he'd earned the right. O was meditative. A perfect circle, carved with a series of overlapping curved cuts that blended seamlessly together. Jake took his time, making each cut deliberate and smooth. The sword sang its high, clear note, and the beryllium surrendered in shavings so fine they were nearly invisible. When he finished the N, Jake stepped back and lowered his sword. His name, Jake Dalton, was carved across the face of Commander Thraka's personal shield in letters 3 inches tall and deep enough to feel with your fingers. The cuts were clean, professional, and absolutely permanent. Jake wiped his blade on his sleeve and sheathed it. There we go. One scratch. Well, technically several thousand scratches arranged in letter shapes, but I think it counts. Thraka stared at the shield. His golden eyes were wide. His mouth hung open. All 4 of his arms had gone limp, and he was holding the shield now like it was a dead thing, like it had betrayed him personally. The arena exploded. It wasn't cheering. Exactly. It was more like the sound of 300 different species all having existential crises simultaneously. Jake heard shouting in at least a dozen languages. Someone was chanting something that his translator kept rendering as, "The human broke physics." Another voice kept repeating, "Impossible," over and over, like a mantra. A few of the cadets had their phones out, recording video. Jake made a mental note to check the station's social media later. This was definitely going viral. Thraka looked up from the shield to Jake, then back to the shield, then back to Jake. "How?" he finally managed. "Would you like the short answer or the long answer?" "Any answer, please." Jake gestured at the shield. "May I?" Thraka handed it over like a man in a dream. Jake held it up to the light, turning it so the crowd could see the carved name. "So here is the thing about crystalline structures," Jake said, projecting his voice so everyone could hear. "They are incredibly strong along certain axes and relatively weak along others. The strength comes from the molecular bonds, sure, but those bonds are directional. When you said the crystalline orientation was randomized, you accidentally told me the shield's weakness." "That makes no sense," Thraka said. "It does if you understand grain structure. See, crystals grow in predictable patterns. Even when you randomize the orientation, you get boundaries where different crystal zones meet. Those boundaries are the weak points. Not weak enough to matter against blunt force or energy weapons, but weak enough that a blade at exactly the right angle can exploit them." Jake ran his finger along one of the carved lines. "I spent 15 minutes thinking about everything you told me. Then I spent the first few attempts reading the shield's structure. Once I found the patterns, it was just a matter of precision. Cut along the grain instead of against it. Work with the material instead of against it. It's the same principle Japanese swordsmiths have used for 1,000 years. The arena was dead quiet now. Every eye was on Jake. Even Thraka seemed to be listening, though he still looked like he'd been hit in the head with a physics textbook. "The sword is not about strength," Jake continued. "It is about technique. About understanding your target better than your target understands itself. You can have the hardest armor in the galaxy, but if someone knows how it is made, how the molecules bond, how the structure forms, they can find a way through. Every defense has a weakness. You just have to be smart enough to find it." He handed the shield back to Thraka. "So yeah, I scratched it. Several thousand times, in fact. My name is now a permanent part of your personal equipment. You are welcome." Thraka held the shield like it was evidence at a crime scene. His scaled face had gone through several colors in the last 30 seconds, settling on a pale purple that suggested either shock or a minor stroke. Jake couldn't tell which. Hava. "But the quantum reinforcement," Thraka said weakly. "The molecular bonds. The master smiths of Varela Prime spent centuries perfecting this material." "And they did a great job," Jake said. "Seriously, this is impressive work. But here's the thing about master craftsmen. They get really good at making something one specific way, and after a while, they stop questioning whether that way has any flaws. They just assume it is perfect because it has always worked before." Jake pulled out his sword again, not to threaten, just to illustrate. He held it up so the lights caught the rand, wavy pattern in the steel. "See this? This is a Hamon line. It is created during the differential hardening process. The edge is hard enough to hold sharpness, but the spine is softer and more flexible. That combination gives you a blade that can cut and also absorb impact without shattering. It is a compromise, an acknowledgement that no material is perfect for every situation." He sheathed the blade again. "Your Varelium smiths made their material optimized for one thing, stopping high-energy impacts. Plasma bolts, kinetic rounds, explosions, all the stuff you mentioned. And for that, It is fantastic. But they optimized so hard in one direction that they created a vulnerability in another. The crystalline structure that makes it great at dispersing energy makes it susceptible to precise mechanical stress along specific vectors. You are saying our greatest defensive material has been flawed this entire androgous time? Thraka's voice was barely a whisper now. Not flawed, just specialized. There is a difference. Jake gestured at the crowd. How many people in this station do you think could have done what I just did? Actually carved through beryllium with a hand weapon? Thraka was quiet for a moment. I do not know. I am guessing not many. You need someone who understands both crystalline structures and traditional blade work. Someone who has studied materials science and also spent years learning how to read metal. Someone crazy enough to bring a sword to a space station. That is a pretty specific skill set. Jake walked in a slow circle around Thraka, addressing the crowd now as much as the commander. Humans have been working with metal for about 7,000 years. We have been making swords for most of that time. We have had entire civilizations rise and fall, and through all of it, we kept making blades and figuring out better ways to make them cut. Not because we are violent. Well, not just because we are violent, but because we are curious. We want to understand how things work. He stopped and faced Thraka again. When you gave me that lecture about the beryllium crystalline structure, you thought you were showing off. And you were. But you were also teaching. You told me everything I needed to know to beat your shield. The growth process, the bonding method, the randomized orientation. You gave me a complete technical breakdown of your defense, and then you were surprised when I used that information. I did not think it mattered, Thraka admitted. I thought the material was invulnerable. Nothing is invulnerable. That is lesson 1 in any human combat doctrine. Everything has a weakness. Armor has joints. Shields have edges. Fortresses have gates. The stronger something appears, the more important it becomes to find that one critical flaw. Jake tapped the carved shield with one finger. Your shield's flaw was its own complexity. Too many crystalline boundaries. Too much structural variation. It made the material incredibly strong against random impacts, but vulnerable to someone who could read those variations and exploit them systematically. A voice called out from the crowd. It was one of the cadets, a tall, thin alien that looked like a praying mantis crossed with a giraffe. But how did you see the crystalline boundaries? We cannot see them. The shield looks uniform to us. Human eyes are pretty good, Jake said. We are persistence hunters. We evolved to track prey over long distances by spotting tiny details, broken twigs, disturbed dirt, changes in color or texture that most predators would miss. That same visual processing helps us spot patterns in materials. I am not saying my eyes are magic. I am saying they are trained. I have been studying metal grain for years. I know what to look for. Another voice, this one deeper and raspier. Could this technique work on other materials? On our armor? Our hulls? Jake shrugged. Maybe. I would have to study them. Every material is different. But the principle is universal. Understand the structure, find the stress points, apply force precisely. It works on metal, on crystal, on ceramic, on composite materials. Physics does not care what your armor is made of. Physics just cares about molecular bonds and force vectors. The crowd erupted in conversation. Jake could see cadets arguing with each other, instructors pulling out data pads and running calculations. Someone was already trying to contact the Beryllium Smiths on Varela Prime, probably to tell them their entire product line had just been compromised by a human with a sharp stick. Thraka still looked shell-shocked, but something had shifted in his expression. The arrogance was gone. The condescension had evaporated. Now he just looked like a soldier who had learned something new and was trying to process the tactical implications. You could have failed, Thraka said quietly. You risked your career on a theory. On a guess. That was foolish. Maybe, Jake agreed. But I was tired of being laughed at. Sometimes you have to take a risk to make a point. Besides, it was not really a guess. I did the math. I knew it would work. I just was not sure I could execute it cleanly enough to make it impressive. Impressive, Thraka repeated. He looked down at his shield, at Jake's name carved permanently into its surface. Yes, I suppose that is one word for it. So, Jake said, letting the word hang in the air, we had a deal. Thraka's shoulders sagged. All four of his arms dropped to his sides. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. But when he spoke, his voice was clear and steady, a soldier keeping his word. Attention, Thraka announced, his voice amplified through the arena. I, Commander Thraka, do hereby apologize to Instructor Jake Dalton. I called his weapon primitive. I called his species primitive. I was wrong. I apologized to him, and to all humans, for my ignorance and arrogance. The arena was silent. Then, slowly, someone started clapping. Then another. Then a dozen. Then 100. Within seconds, the entire crowd was applauding, the sound echoing off the arena walls like thunder. Jake nodded to Thraka. Apology accepted, Commander. Thraka managed a weak smile. I suspect I am going to regret this demonstration for the rest of my life. Probably. Jake agreed cheerfully. But hey, at least you will never forget my name. Jake turned to leave the arena, sword slung casually over his shoulder, when he realized he wasn't going to make it to the exit alone. A wall of cadets had materialized between him and the door. Not threatening, just incredibly, intensely interested. The praying mantis alien was at the front of the pack. Instructor Dalton, you must teach us this technique. The pattern recognition, the angle calculations, everything. I want to learn human blade work, said a stocky rock-like creature that Jake was pretty sure was literally made of minerals. Can you teach someone with no joints how to use a sword? Is it true humans spent thousands of years just fighting each other with metal sticks? This from a floating jellyfish thing that pulsed with bioluminescence. That sounds extremely inefficient but also fascinating. Jake held up his hands. Okay. One at a time. Yes, I can teach you. That is literally why I am here. Class starts tomorrow morning at 0700. Bring questions. Bring enthusiasm. Do not bring plasma weapons because we will not be using them. The crowd parted as he walked through, but they followed him like ducklings. By the time Jake reached the corridor outside the arena, he had at least 40 cadets trailing behind him, all talking at once, all wanting to know more about Earth combat techniques and metallurgy, and whether it was true that humans used to settle disputes by hitting each other with swords until someone surrendered or died. That last one is mostly true, yeah, Jake admitted. We have mellowed out since then, mostly. Behind him, still standing in the center of the arena, Commander Thraka held his defaced shield and stared at it like it contained the secrets of the universe. Which, in a way, it did. The secrets were just written in a human name instead of ancient Varelian script. An instructor approached Thraka, a scaled creature with too many eyes. Commander, what do you want us to do about this? Should we file a complaint with the coalition? Demand the human be removed? Thraka was quiet for a long moment. Then he laughed. It was a different laugh than before. Not mocking, not cruel. Just genuinely amused at the absurdity of the situation. No, Thraka said. We are going to keep him. We are going to learn everything he knows. And then we are going to make sure every cadet in this academy understands that technology is not a substitute for knowledge, and strength is not a substitute for skill. But your shield, sir. Your reputation. Thraka looked down at the carved letters one more time. My reputation will recover. My shield, however, is ruined. He paused. Or perhaps not ruined. Perhaps improved. After all, it now tells a story. The story of the day a human taught me that we have been fighting in space for so long we forgot how to fight smart. He tucked the shield under one of his forearms and walked toward the exit. Come, we have curriculum to revise. If one human with a sword can defeat our best defensive technology, imagine what he can teach our cadets about finding weaknesses in enemy defenses, about thinking creatively instead of relying on superior firepower. You want to integrate primitive Earth combat techniques into our advanced warfare training? Primitive, Thraka said, is clearly not the right word. Unconventional, perhaps. Unexpected. The kind of tactics that enemies with superior technology would never see coming because they would assume, as I did, that old methods are obsolete methods. He paused at the arena door and looked back one last time at this, the empty floor where Jake had done the impossible. The human said every defense has a weakness, Thraka said quietly. He was right, and now he works for us. That makes us either very fortunate or very dangerous. Possibly both. Meanwhile, 3 corridors away, Jake had finally escaped the swarm of eager cadets by promising to answer all their questions in class tomorrow. He found a quiet observation deck overlooking the planet below, a swirling blue and green world that wasn't Earth but reminded him of home anyway. His phone buzzed. A message from the Academy's administrative office. Contract confirmed. Permanent position as Senior Instructor of Unconventional Warfare. Generous salary. Full benefits. Housing provided. Congratulations on a successful first day. Jake laughed and typed back a reply. Thanks. It was definitely memorable. Another message appeared, this one from an unknown sender. When Jake opened it, he found a photo. It was his name, carved into Thraka's shield, shot in dramatic lighting with professional composition. Already it had 17,000 shares on the station's social network. The caption read, "Human defeats impossible material with ancient weapon. Full story at link." Jake saved the photo. His mom was going to love this. He looked out at the stars, at the endless black, punctuated by distant lights, and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He had come to Station Kepler 9 with a sword and a dream. He was leaving his first day with a job, a reputation, and the knowledge that somewhere in the galaxy, Commander Thraka was going to see Jake's name on his shield every single day for the rest of his military career. Not a bad start. Behind him, the observation deck door hissed open. Thraka stepped through, still carrying the shield. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the planet turn below. "I am going to display this in my office," Thraka said finally. "As a reminder." A reminder of what? That arrogance is a weakness. That assumption is a flaw. That the most dangerous opponent is not the one with the biggest weapon, but the one who understands the fight better than you do. Thraka glanced at Jake. "Also as a reminder that humans are terrifying and should never be underestimated again." Jake grinned. "We grow on you. Like a particularly persistent fungus, yes." They stood together, human and alien, instructor and commander, watching the stars wheel overhead. Tomorrow there would be classes to teach, techniques to demonstrate, and a whole academy of cadets eager to learn the human way of war. But tonight, there was just this. A quiet moment. A mutual respect earned through steel and stubbornness, and somewhere in the station's maintenance bay, a weapons technician was going to have a very confusing conversation with his supervisor about why they needed to completely redesign their understanding of material vulnerability. Humanity had arrived in the galaxy, and the galaxy was never going to be quite the same.